Aloha. Friends of the East-West Center welcomes our old friends and new friends this new season of the China Seminar. This is the 47th year program established in 1977 by Professor Daniel Kwok as an informal venue where China experts and the community can gather to share their thoughts and expertise on China. We start this season with a distinguished scholar and person with a military career and diplomacy, David Stilwell. Dave's got a list of accomplishments that make him eminently qualified to talk about today's topic. Democracy anywhere is a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Dave is a former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and served in the Air Force as a Brigadier General. He has extensive experience as a linguist, fighter pilot, and commander in Japan and Korea. And he served on the East-West Center Board of Governors from 2021 to 2024. He just finished an assignment at the Air Force Academy, teaching cadets Mandarin and other subjects within his expertise. There can't be any more topical subject for Dave to talk about today. It's great to have you here, Dave. The floor is now yours.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the generous introduction. I tell you, my greatest accomplishment was getting through the East-West Center program, and for which I'm a very proud alum. Thank you for the opportunity here to talk about a timely subject dealing with the People's Republic of China and our electoral process. This time last year, I was in Taiwan, and we met with the Minister of Digital Affairs, Audrey Tong, about how they were preparing to deal with what we knew was going to be interference and disruption of the electoral process in Taiwan, seen as a direct threat to the CCP. And since then, we've been able to stay in touch with the Ministry of Digital Affairs. And I'll pass on some of the lessons, but I'll just say that the nature of the threat here and in Taiwan are different. And so I will now share my screen. Here it is, okay. And we are going to talk about the threat, okay? So if you're an authoritarian Communist Party member, you understand that you're seeing a lot of people leaving the country, and a lot of people aren't coming to the country. This card here, the last time I was in the People's Republic, which is truly the last time because they banned me from ever coming back due to my work at the State Department. But this card here, they added that section there I circled called Settle Down, Ding Ju. And I noticed that they added that, and yet you see not a large take rate on, hang on a sec, there we go. You don't see a large take rate on people coming to the PRC. And so only about 1,000 people per year come. Since COVID, it's even less than that. And since the party has been cracking down, it's even less. And so when you see massive outflows of your own people going to the US and elsewhere, and very few people coming in, that's a statement about how socialism with Chinese characteristics is going. At the same time, all these people are escaping. Last year alone, 35,000, they estimate, Chinese citizens came into the US through the southern border. Those are the ones they actually interacted with. There's clearly more that they didn't see come through. 40 days of travel just to get to a place where they have a choice of who their leaders are and a voice in how they're governed. And so you can see that this is a direct threat to the PRC. And the obvious answer would be to liberalize and open up to democracy's many benefits. Even though it's the worst form of government, it's still better than all the others, says Churchill. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Some quick lessons on what Taiwan learned, because they understand this problem better than most, especially the differences where it doesn't quite equate. The fear of authoritarians of giving their people a voice and a choice, primarily focused on Document 9, which was released in April 2012, and then winning without fighting. This is a idea from Sun Tzu from the Warring States periods, 500 BC. But it's how you destroy an enemy without actually using armed conflict weapons and the like. You do it through creating hate and discontent and divisions inside the target society to divide, weaken, and conquer. And finally, I'll come up with some suggestions of what you can do. Here's the books I used. People always ask what my sources are. Rob Spalding, both Stealth War and War Without Rules is a great one. Clive Hamilton, Silent Invasion, and the others you can see there. China's global influence comes out of the Asia-Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, so hat tip to them for a very well put together compendium of ideas of how the PRC uses influence in the world. Political Warfare is one of my favorite books on this subject. Document 9, and then if you're interested in TikTok and the problems of social media, Jonathan Haidt has some really good writings. Here's the bottom line. We, open societies, despite all the friction and the dysfunction and all the rest, are still more attractive than closed authoritarian societies. There is no soft power coming out of the PRC. Elections, when the Chinese people can see that the people in Taiwan are allowed to elect their leaders, it is a direct threat to the CCP. Second point, they have access to our societies and they use it quite well. Awareness is the primary defense, and then we need to work on our own education system primarily to develop citizens who understand how to deal with the new world of social media. And finally, their primary information vector in the US is TikTok. It's like Facebook, which was developed to basically generate clickbait. If you like cat videos, you'll get more cat videos. TikTok has taken that idea and weaponized it to create divisions and polarization in our society. It's controlled by the CCP through ByteDance. That makes it a foreign agent, and we do have laws that allow FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act, to regulate or actually eliminate TikTok. So the process is in work that by January of 25, TikTok should be out of this country in some form, but there are other routes to take, and I would advocate for all. Here's why. If you look at that block between 40 and 60, that's Instagram. So the norms of reporting on the presidents, on soccer, entertainers, and all that stuff, that's what you would see. Now you take what is being shown on TikTok, all those things are normal from Trump on down, but above that, you note that any discussion of Hong Kong protests, sensitive subjects like the June 4th incident in 1989, Tibet, all those are squashed and censored. So people who make the argument that banning TikTok is censorship need to acknowledge that TikTok itself is a censorship platform. And who was the first country to ban TikTok? China was. TikTok in its form here in the West is not allowed in the PRC. They use one called Douyin, which is basically a one-direction transmit, Xi Jinping thought, to the users of that. So, I mean, if it's so radioactive that the PRC won't allow their own people to use it, why do we allow it in our own country? And if you're a parent, you should be very concerned about the rates of suicide. TikTok actually drives vulnerable teenagers to suicide. If you have kids, I would recommend looking at this website, Scrolling to Death, to see more on that. So we allow in our country PRC information manipulation in forms like TikTok and a bunch of others that I'll show you here. And going into the election in November, they have been on fire. They've been going full tilt. So from what we saw in January 2024 in Taiwan, there are some lessons we can learn. The photo on the left is from 2020. It's from the South China Morning Post. But there's a lot of these things coming out of Global Times, China Daily, and others in the 2024 election that sought to undermine the DPP and advocate for the KMT, the Kuomintang, to the point that Terry Gou, who was the third-party champion for the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, was basically pressured to withdraw because they saw him dividing the KMT vote. So the PRC has strong economic and other influence in Taiwan. Taiwan does a very good job in the public and civil sectors to prepare their people for these sorts of things. In some ways, it's obvious. Language, the PRC does a good job of putting things into the original Chinese characters, but they miss a lot of points, especially in the algorithms and the backing data. So it's not that hard for Taiwan citizens to recognize information coming out of the PRC. Other lessons that I'll show you do accrue, but here's the point. In Taiwan, the main focus is on the PRC. In the United States, the main focus is on each other. We are internally focused, and the PRC is helping that. And so a lot of the things that Taiwan learned on this don't necessarily apply to us, except for making us aware that the PRC is interested in manipulating how we think about each other, about our own form of government, and how we think about the PRC. One of the outcomes of the Taiwan election that we unfortunately, I don't think can use is the idea of fact checkers. They still have objective reporting because it's related not to each other, but it's related to the PRC. And so those fact checkers still have credibility. Dr. Kato is here, and he and I have had some long conversations about the fourth estate regaining needed objectivity and trust. And we don't agree on this, and we exercise civil discourse as we talk to each other on that, and we learn from each other. And that's one of the things we should take from this. Finally, one of the presenters recently on the Taiwan elections is a guy named Liu Wenping. He's from the Ministry of Justice Investigation Bureau, looking into this. And he talks about local collaborators. The PRC, if they come directly into our society or Taiwan, are obvious. They're heavy-handed, they're clunky and all that stuff. So what they do is they use what Lenin called, I know this word. Useful idiots. Polyezhnia idioti. There we go, the one Russian word I know. They use useful idiots. They use people in the US who then retweet these things. They put out and they advocate for PRC messages. And that makes it much more difficult to recognize and to deal with that. Toward the end of this and through all of this, I would love to hear thoughts from the audience on where do you find honest, objective, and unbiased information going into the election so you, as a voter, can make the best possible choice of who your leaders are. Here's one of the things that are interesting out of Taiwan, the rule of twos. Anytime they detected PRC intrusion, they said any response we come up with has to take place within 2 hours. Timely, right? Because the news cycle is so quick it can be forgotten. So they need to get something out within 2 hours. It needs to be 200 words or less because nobody reads past headlines anymore, right? And a good example of this was about maybe 8 months ago. Someone sent me this headline and says, you know, because I was in the Trump administration, Dave, how is this possible that he can argue that he's allowed to use SEAL Team 6 to kill his political rivals? This goes to the 200-word thing. Had they just read down to the second paragraph in this article, they would have seen that it wasn't the Trump team that said this. It was the judge that was doing the questioning of Trump's attorney who said, if, hypothetical, Trump ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, would he then be subject to criminal prosecution? And the rest of that's irrelevant. The point is that not just, some people, a lot of people bought off on this and they believe the headline, and getting them to come off that point is very difficult. So be very careful. In long answers, they've got to be quick and tight, and people have to see the truth and the facts up front because they're very easily misled. And the last thing is they used images quite well in Taiwan. 2 images. Now I'm showing you one because this one in itself is compelling. But between 2 hours, 200 words, and 2 images, that was a useful response to PRC intrusion into their electoral system. So who's the honest broker in our system? What we were just talking about before this started was at the Academy, we developed a course on critical thinking to help people be suspicious of these things. I'm going to talk about what that looks like. But in the end, if you read something and it makes you angry or giddy, you probably need to do more research before you draw to any conclusions. And like I said, the threat to Taiwan is from the outside. That way, it's not quite so emotional and it's expected. When we're so inwardly focused, we have other issues. If you haven't read the resignation letter by Barry Weiss as she left the New York Times, or more recently, Yuri Berliner's critique of how NPR is steering information, it's well worth the read. Okay, so number 2, the goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to make the world safe for its particular brand of governance, the socialism with Chinese characteristic, what we would call autocracy. And all this, all the words here from Beckley and Brands, Hal Brands, it just says that the PRC truly is, like Wilson, trying to make the world safe for its choice of governance systems. In this case, it's autocracy, single strongmanly rule without really considering the concerns of its people. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes out of this document 9. It's a leaked document that's since been validated of the PRC naming what it sees its threats to its future, and then ideas in how it can prevent those threats from undermining its legitimacy and continued rule. And it sees outside ideas as infiltrating their system, yet they have no problem with using their outside ideas to infiltrate ours. This is when I was at State Department, we developed a program called reciprocity, where if we weren't getting the same treatment in Beijing, if our diplomats or our media people weren't getting the same treatment, then we were working on denying that same treatment to the PRC. That's the main tool diplomats have. And so they don't like infiltration of democratic ideas in their own system. I think we should be doing a better job of getting it into them. The very first, you don't have to read the whole thing, but the very first section, excuse me, of this government document 9 talks about Western constitutional democracy as a threat to the continued governance of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you need any reason, if you have a doubt why they are busy manipulating the many elections going on, 2 billion people are going to the polls in 40 countries this year. We're among the last of that. And they're very active in those because, again, they see this as a threat. The fact that it happens in Taiwan, another Chinese society, is probably the greatest threat. But you can see the paranoid, but actually realistic assessment of why people like democratic electoral systems and why they're not really crazy about socialism with Chinese characteristics. Change does happen in the PRC, however. If you remember, back in November 22, in Urumqi, there was a building caught fire where they had a bunch of COVID patients locked inside. They could not escape, and many burned to death. And people were so sick of zero COVID by that time that mass protests broke out all over the PRC, same as we saw in June of 1989, the Tiananmen incident. This forced the government to back off, but that's not what we consider democracy. We're not giving these people a chance to vote. They're coming up out of anger and frustration and speaking out. So what's life like today? Well, he says it himself. Anybody who says that ByteDance is a private company misses the point that Xi Jinping says China rules everything. All things fall in the party's everywhere, and it leads everything. So the things that we see happening are by design. So that an important point here is to understand the differences in our two systems, a democratic system versus authoritarianism. So people who have not lived outside the United States do not understand that rule of law, fazhi in the Chinese sense, is interpreted entirely opposite. Our own documents say that we establish government, and the government leads based on our consent, and that consent is offered through elections and laws and all the rest of that stuff. The law itself is in the form of the Constitution, Bill of Rights. All those things is there to protect who from whom? The law is there to protect the people from a rapacious government. This seems to us common sense. However, when you look at the system in the PRC, it is exactly opposite. When they say rule by law, they interpret it differently. In English, fazhi, it means that in their history, the system has been like this for a very long time. The people then trust the government to be benevolent and inerrant, and that the law in China, in the People's Republic of China, protects the government from the people. Anybody who says they have good lawyers when they go to the PRC with a good idea for manufacturing doesn't understand that there are no good courts. So the law, rule by law in China, protects the government from its own people. Hopefully that explains a major difference in how they approach us. Now, intrusion into our systems, again, open democracies allow this. We invite people into our country, and people of all shapes, sizes, and bents. If you can run a good campaign and get elected, then you will be allowed to lead. So here's some examples of what that intrusion looks like. Alice Guo in the Philippines was the mayor of the city of Bamban. And it turns out there's solid evidence that she was working for the Chinese Communist Party in that capacity. Linda Sun is accused, due process is still in effect, but part of the New York State government in Albany, she's accused of having taken a lot of actions that supports the PRC at the PRC's bidding. And then there's Sam Destiari from Australia, who was actually tried and convicted and then left the government because of his involvement, basically involved money, elite capture. Most of the media, Chinese language media in the United States, is controlled by the PRC. This is how they get their message to Chinese people of all, recent arrivals, long-term arrivals. And if any of you here in Hawaii remember 103.9 KUPA, they hosted the Zhongxuanbu, the Chinese Central Propaganda Bureau, broadcasts on that frequency until about 2018. But you were hearing direct from Beijing Chinese propaganda. It still exists in most other major cities. The ambassador, Sui Tiankai, during COVID, had full access to the American people on Sunday morning talk shows. Our ambassador, Nick Burns, now it complains, of course, that he has no access to the Chinese people. So they come into our system and they deny us access to theirs. All I ask is a fair shake. We had a letter to a legislator in the state of Wisconsin asking them to publish that letter that they'd written, praising the PRC's handling of COVID. And then there's always greed and economic inducements that have worked quite well. Those of you who have been paying attention, we used to get China Daily in the front lobby here. New York Times, I think, still has a China Daily insert in their paper. Maybe not. Hopefully they've stopped doing that. But again, they have full access to us. They use that access to manipulate the information space, to divide, polarize, and conquer and weaken the United States in the process. And it's on fire here at this particular period of time in the election season. So in the last 2 minutes here, here's some solutions. Education, I talked about the trip to Taiwan. We went and talked to Audrey Tong and the Minister of Digital Affairs. We're learning from them. Spoke with Professor Iris Wong, who runs a great program there on critical thinking in the K through 12 and beyond to help the Taiwan people discern truth from fiction and those things. We took what we learned from them, and we established a course at the Air Force Academy on the same thing. So we teach critical thinking, not the concept, but physically how to do it at the Air Force Academy. Hopefully that will gain traction. How do you incentivize, since we're a capitalist country, a market-based economy, how do you incentivize objectivity? That Walter Cronkite, had the best viewership of all evening news because he was seen as a reliable and honest source of information. How do we get back to objectivity? The free press, which I subscribe to, I very happily pay my $50 a year, I think does a really good job of showing both sides of any story. In the same way National Public Radio used to before 2016. If you want to see more on that, read what Yuri Berliner has to say. And then the last resort, and I hate to say this, and I've been criticized for it, but if the friction and the hate and open fighting over electoral integrity continues, I mean, we send in voters to other countries to observe and call balls and strikes. I mean, I hope we never have to come to that, but after 2020 and 2016, I think we should start thinking about that. Finally, when you hear the words conspiracy theory, you should tense up because there's more to the story. There's always more to the story. And how do we go backwards? Yeah. I'll get to that in a second. Here's what we use for critical thinking education, the RED model. Recognize assumptions, evaluate arguments, and then draw conclusions, but do not decide. Leave room for more information. The problem today is people, when they hear something that aligns with the way they think, it firms up their position and they're not as eager to hear what other people have to say. We need to remain open to suggestion. We talk about metacognition, and that deals with how your brain works. Your prefrontal cortex, which is your logic and your thoughtful brain, versus your amygdala, which is your lizard brain, which is where your emotion comes from. Most information today stimulates the lizard brain. It creates emotional and opioid responses in things like dopamine, and we can talk about more about it if you want. And then finally, don't judge people. Listen to what they have to say. Relearn the art of civil discourse. Find people you don't agree with and talk to them and hear what they have to say. And then don't judge them. Instead of judging or thinking about what you're going to say next, listen to what they have to say. If we do those things like elections will be less fraught. They'll go back to the boring activities that we remember from the 80s and 90s. Whenever I hear conspiracy theory, I think like this. We know the pandemic came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but for the longest times, I was called a conspiracy theorist for actually stating that. I was canceled from Twitter for saying that. So with that, I will end. As information for the election comes through, everybody, if you get angry or emotional, slow down, read the article, find people who disagree with you, and then draw conclusions from that. With that, I will turn it back over for conversation. Anyway, I love humor. I love memes like this.
Given your thoughts on democracy and China, what do you think, or why do you think Xi Jinping seems to be, President Xi seems to be ambivalent about who wins the election this year? Why do you think that is? Or do you think he's really ambivalent?
Oh, no, he's definitely ambivalent. Putin apparently has picked, he's endorsed one candidate, but the Chinese side, the PRC side, remember, I talk about the PRC, I don't talk about China. I got nothing against Chinese people or the society or the food or the language or the culture. It's all wonderful. We have to be very clear that we're talking about the government here. And so when the PRC looks at elections in the US, they really don't care who is elected. They know that they don't have that much influence over either, but they do know that the system itself is a threat to them. So what they're attacking is the system. People have lost confidence in elections. You've heard people on both sides, call into question the integrity of elections. If people who, there are people who still refuse to admit or agree that the outcomes of the 2016, 20, or 24 elections. That absolutely supports
In the country?
So the guy I worked for at the Air Force Academy, Vijay Shwedo, he was in charge of the electoral integrity protection from outside influences for the 2020 election. And he says there are absolutely undeniable evidence that the foreign hostile governments take advantage of our open system with bots, with manipulating data and all those things to get Americans to the polls, not the electoral polls, but to the opposite sides of the spectrum. And it's been working to their effect. I can show you where news outlets, seemingly reputable news outlets, will pick up a narrative from the PRC Propaganda Bureau that they insert through Twitter, and then they will start repeating it. So this system, this process the PRC has developed has been very effective over time. How do we prevent it? I think all Americans, one, K through 12 education has got to catch up to social media. It just doesn't, we don't talk about it, right? So we need to teach our kids to respect this. It's a great tool, but it's also enormously dangerous. Like I said, teenage suicide, divisions in our society. So look at what Australia does. Voting is mandatory in Australia, right? It's against the law not to vote. People should take their vote a lot more seriously. They should invest the time to learn more about what each side stands for and then make an informed decision.
Well, given your belief that China is actively working against democracy. What do you think they're doing in China in terms of democratic ideas being communicated and transmitted to China from America and other democracies?
Well, the very first thing they did was they called it the Jinduan, the Great Firewall, that protects the Chinese people from getting any information other than that the government deems useful or necessary. Now, does that mean that the Chinese people don't understand what's going on? They absolutely do. Through VPNs, word of mouth. I mean, trying to control information is like trying to hold water in your hands. It's going to leak out. So the information is getting to them. Taiwan elections are like a Olympic sport, from what I've heard from my friends in the PRCs. They watch it with great interest. That's the first thing, is they put up this cyber firewall to make sure that information is not allowed in. Let me just say that the PRC is a signatory and actually helped develop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947, I think. And that Universal Declaration of Human Rights says all citizens have the right to free access to information, that governments cannot cut off their people from information. PRC is a signatory and actually sat on the process to develop those things, and yet they do exactly the opposite. So we should hold them accountable for that. We should make them open up their information systems. They should allow our diplomats to access the Chinese people, to talk to them about how things happen and why they happen in the U.S. That's all I ask. One, I hope we can educate our own people better, but I also would like to educate the Chinese people better, that there are better, there are other options besides socialism with Chinese characteristics, and Xi Jinping thought.
Let me turn to some of the questions here. What do you think is the PRC government's goal in amplifying socially divisive messages in U.S. social media? China still needs the U.S. to remain stable enough to provide markets for Chinese products and to generate new technology innovation for China to acquire.
Well, I like the way you put that, because on the one hand, they don't want to see the democratic process working as well as it does, because it's attractive to their own people. But at the same time, as you say, if the whole thing collapses, I guess you'd have to look at the statement of priorities. I just read this getting ready for this. I can't remember which book it was in. But the number one priority is the continued governance of the Chinese Communist Party, is staying in power so they can continue this Marxist socialist dream that they are trying to resuscitate, to bring from the ashes of the Soviet Union's attempt. In fact, so I think it's a matter of priorities. The economic aspects, trading partner markets and all that stuff, falls a distant second from the need to protect themselves and their ability to run the country. And again, our system, with all of its flaws, is a direct threat to that.
Question. Any thoughts on the history of U.S. CIA funding, arming, and training of Tibetan revolutionaries?
I honestly don't know about that. But Tibet was an independent state prior to 1950, when it was annexed by the PRC. And so your revolutionary is another man's freedom fighter. How we support that in any number of ways. I mean, by simply meeting with the Dalai Lama is a way we support them. Whether we actually, every time you say something like the CIA activity and encouraging revolution and all that stuff, Bay of Pigs comes to mind. And so, these things don't always work out as planned. But there are things we can do in the overt and visible world to also support them, and meeting, or how about calling into question the PRC constant pointing to their own laws that say the Dalai Lama is required by law to reincarnate inside Tibet. I mean, talk about missing the point. You've got the mundane world here, which we do have some control over, and they have the spiritual world, which they claim to have control over as well. That's a little tone deaf, I do believe. And that's part of that tone deafness is to our advantage, by the way, by cutting themselves off from the information space the rest of the world has access to. They do come across as tone deaf and heavy-handed. The great example of this is when People's Daily republished an article out of The Onion, a parody publication of the University of Wisconsin, declaring Kim Jong-un the sexiest man alive. And the People's Daily published this as though it was a real article. So look, they shoot themselves in the foot all the time. I would like to help them shoot more, if we could.
Okay. There have been reports from some American news agencies that Chinese, quote, police are contacting Chinese people in America and asking them to return to China. Is this true?
It's called Operation Fox Hunt, and they are spirited out of our country in any number of ways. Airlines, it's just hard to get someone out by airline, but our ports are sieves, and you can load stuff onto a ship without anybody really checking what's in it. And so there are a lot of ways these people, now a lot of times they're encouraged, generally through financial inducements or through threats to family. That's another major lever they have, is to hold family members remaining in the PRC hostage until college students tone down the rhetoric, or then they come home for prosecution, et cetera. And so there's a lot of ways that they come after their own people. There's a story in this book, Political Warfare, in the beginning, that talks about Guo Wengwei, who has now been indicted for corruption. But the opening in this book is Guo Wengwei and how PRC operatives from the Ministry of State Security, thugs, came to the United States on tourist passports, approached Guo Wengwei in his penthouse hotel apartment in New York City. The FBI met them at the bottom of the elevator and says, "You need to go home. You are operating outside of your tourist visa." They instead went to DC, debriefed with their own embassy, were told to go back and talk to him one more time. And this time the FBI held them and then asked the State Department what to do. The State Department's response at the time was, "Let them go. We don't want to harm the relationship." I was all about harming the relationship. If they do stuff like that, I'm going, we, when I was in the State Department, we're going to invoke appropriate consequences. So yes, it happens.
Are you familiar with the News Literacy Project, nonprofit founded by Alan Miller, an East-West Center alumnus, who seeking to ensure all students are skilled in news literacy before they graduate high school, giving them the knowledge and ability to participate in civic society as well as other form of critical thinking? Very much, very much. In fact, when we started this project on critical thinking, he was one of the first people I talked to. Checkology is one of those processes, which I think is awesome. We do things like that in our course as well. Is basically we throw out an issue, and then we ask the cadets to go to BBC or pick a site and then discuss the different approaches to that particular topic and then talk about why. And then we try to get them to, we usually pick spicy subjects, things that get people really angry in this country, and to see if they can find a way to the center on those things. So anything that deals with media literacy. Now, I would caution, though, that like most things in the US today, look, anytime a fact checker gets it wrong, I was going to include a slide on this, but I ran out of time. Anytime a fact checker gets something wrong, lots of fact checkers says that the Wuhan Institute of Virology origins of the pandemic were conspiracy theory. When they get it wrong, they should go out of business. I mean, if they don't do due diligence to find out the full story before they come in on one side, then they should not be allowed. They should be completely discredited. And so I'm all about media literacy as long as it is unbiased. But if you're going to the New York Times for all of your information, thinking it is truly the paper of record, then I'll show you 10 examples right now of how they got it wrong, badly. So would you like me to start? What's on your reading list again?
So what I read Nikkei. Nikkei has a really good English language site that to me comes across as balanced. It's a subscription as well. Free press, we've talked about this. Yes, it has an agenda and you can see it, but it does, like I said before, try to show you both sides of any discussion. So you then have the ability to, with that information, make your own decisions. BBC used to be good, but on US domestic, BBC's kind of gone off into, in my opinion, it's gone off to one side. So, but here's again, hopefully we get some suggestions from the audience. Is what do you consider a good objective source of information? And if anybody has ideas, I'm wide open to hearing what they are.
There's a question. Could you comment on the PRC's history of taking Western hostages, such as Australian journalist Chung Lei and academic Yang Hung Boon, for espionage or no charges at all?
Well, the most obvious case there is Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who were taken hostages when Meng Wanzhou, the heiress to the Huawei, was detained in Canada for conducting for working with Iran, which violates American sanctions. As soon as no sooner was she taken to prison than the two Michaels were held almost 3 years with no access to consular, with no communications with their families. They basically locked in solitary. That's inhumane. While Meng Wanzhou was in one of her two mansions in Vancouver. A third victim of that, by the way, was an American whose name I don't remember, who had just been convicted of drug crimes up in Shenyang in northeast China, and was sentenced to something like 5 years of prison and deportation. They brought him back for double jeopardy and then sentenced him to death because of Meng Wanzhou. So if you need any more information, that's probably the most obvious to all of us. But here's another one that just happened. David Lin, a Christian minister, went to China 20 years ago to talk about his own faith in the PRC. And he's been arrested and held for over 20 years. His kids were held, by the way. They were released at some point. But they not only held him, but they held his children as well. So the Biden administration managed to get David Lin out. That's an impressive feat. And he is back free. Hopefully he will tell his story as a warning to others who think they can go to the PRC and operate as they do in the United States. Because believe me, you don't have the same rights and all the rest. It is a different society. It's an authoritarian society.
So, Dave, is there any fear about the different allegations lodged against Chinese in America who are helping the Chinese government? Is there any fear, or is there anything we should fear that this tends to paint anybody, and Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants to America as being spies or potential spies?
The vast majority of people who come here from the People's Republic come here because they seek what we all have: freedom, the ability just to live by your wits, to innovate, do all those things. So, my message has always been that let's not demonize the people. It's not the Chinese people. They're magnificent citizens. I mean, they're kids. Look at the attendance roster at Harvard. These kids are at the very top of the academic accomplishments. Their parents are fantastic advocates for democracy and all the rest. At the same time, we can't, back off of pressing the, PRC operatives and agents in this country. Linda Sun has been accused and, sounds legitimate for manipulating her own government at the behest of the Chinese government. So to deny that there are not Chinese agents in this country, of the 35,000 people that came across the southern border last week, who from the PRC, some percentage of those are been sent there by the Chinese government to do what they do here, to disrupt, undermine, and all the rest. So am I afraid? I am. I'm absolutely afraid that we're going to have the same sort of backlash we had in 1941 against Japanese citizens. This is an education process. We need to talk to the American people and say, look, just because you see an Asian face doesn't mean they're here to undermine. But pay attention to what these people are doing. Pay attention to what everybody, look, Polyezhnia idioti, useful idiots, come in all shapes and sizes and skin colors. And so they're not just Chinese people doing this stuff. There's lots of people in Wall Street who are also playing for the wrong team. I would just say, just be aware. Don't judge people on the color of their skin. That's what America is about. But just be aware. Be prudent. Think about what's going on.
There's a comment. Critical thinking is a fantastic way to help battle this information. Currently, China uses extensive lawfare and gray zone tactics to assert control, spread CCP ideology, and confront the U.S. in its quest to supplant U.S. as the global hegemon. What are some other methods that we, the United States, can employ to react to and defend against misinformation and use of lawfare and gray zone tactics by the CCP?
So this one I've thought about, continuously since 2020. There is no national defense for bad ideas. People are going to believe what they believe, and it's not the government's role to filter that, not by any stretch. Now, National Security Agency can tell where there are sources from hostile governments. Absolutely, we can cut that off. But where we have normal, just regular people writing ideas on social media, there is no defense against that at the national level. The only defense happens at the individual level. There is no other way that we can do this. Now, families are a huge part of this. Parents need to sit down with their kids and explain that, yeah, there was life before text messaging and Twitter, and here's how we used to talk to each other and enjoy each other's company. We need to talk around the kitchen table more. So families are a huge part of that. Schools are absolutely a part of that, as we talked about with Checkology and media. But again, I think the wrong direction to go is to somehow deputize. When we announced the Disinformation Governance Board, the very first thing that came to a lot of people's minds was the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's 1984. Who would go back and then excise names and unpeople and events from the historical record because they were no longer politically acceptable. We can't tolerate that. It's going to have to be at the individual level. Citizens are going to have to defend themselves.
The current, how does this democracy, or does it, play a role in this current dispute in South China Sea between the Philippines and China? Philippines has largely been regarded as a ally of the United States and a democracy.
And President Verzalum has emphasized that the Article 5 does apply, right? On the alliance, our security alliance with the Philippines. Article 5 does apply. An attack on one is attack on all. The Philippines, okay, so when you think about warfare, when you think about political warfare, when you tell an American, especially a military person, when you say war, we think of things blowing up, killing people, breaking their stuff. That's armed conflict. When the PRC says warfare, they're thinking entire spectrum: economic, information, political, lawfare, any number of those things. So the Philippines has figured it out, and they're playing the correct game. And they're using what they call assertive transparency. Instead of hiding this bad behavior that's going on in their own seas, in their own territory, they're putting news crews on their ships, and they're broadcasting this stuff instantly to the world to show. When the PRC says, here's the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and yet there's a Philippine sailor missing a thumb. And if you haven't seen the photo of the degloved bone from that thumb, not the gauze wrapped thumb, that doesn't have the same response. It doesn't generate the same, visceral response as seeing that guy had lost a thumb when a Chinese ship ran into his ship. Video of PRC sailors poking holes in their inflatable boats, sinking their boats out there in Philippine waters and near Philippine territory. The Philippines have done a great job in the information space, assertive transparency. That's a lesson we should learn, that we should deal more. Instead of going after the PRC directly and symmetrically, where they kick me, I punch them, find out where they are weakest, because they're strongest in their eastern maritime space, South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan. They're strongest in that area. You mentioned Tibet earlier. They're very, very weak in the West. They're very weak in the economy. Anybody watching the PRC economy right now is seeing it's coming apart very quickly, starting with the real estate. Trade's going down, consumption in the country is going down, 20% unemployment at least among their kids, who are all laying flat now, Tongping, because there's no reason to try. We should go after those things to let them know we're serious. And at that point, we can actually get them to moderate their behavior.
I guess there are some people in our audience who think that who ask about the Voice of America. Is the Voice of America broadcasting to China? If the VOA is doing that, why can't the Chinese do the same and distributing it?
So as a response to 103.9, and I would just say it's the scale. And VOA is jammed in countries like North Korea and China. I mean, it's a known frequency, either HF or AM band, and so you can jam those things. But that's not, I appreciate that. That's a good counter perspective. But again, the scale of access to the Chinese people varies greatly compared to here in the United States and other open societies and what we have access to in the PRC.
Do you think what happens in the upcoming election here in the United States will change anything, for better or worse?
I don't. We started tariffs in the Trump administration and the Biden administration to my relief, continued them. Janet Yellen is in Beijing right now, or will soon be, discussing the de minimis. So Commerce made an $800 limit. Everything above $800 was subject to customs and tariffs and all that stuff. Anything below is not. And they're going to lower the de minimis down to, I think, 0. So all things coming in, rather than giving the PRC trade advantage, are going to make them trade on a fair basis because we don't get the same treatment there. And so there are things that have been happening in the Biden administration that I think have been very useful. The good thing, as I was mentioning, is if we can get the American people, we've got the truly bipartisan China Commission, their committee in the House, get people to focus on the real threat and stop sniping each other over very, small differences. I think we'll be all better off for that. And we're not adversaries. We're fellow country people. We all come from the same place. We all believe effectively the same things. There's a much bigger problem that we should be dealing with. And I think the Biden or Harris administration will continue that.
Well, I think we're going to wind up. Have to wind up. David's on a busy schedule here, so if I'll pass it on to Anna.